Assalamu alaikum to all the chai lovers and biscuit fans. I'm your host, Anton O'Malley, and welcome back to another Chai and Biscuit podcast. Today, we are traveling to a unique part of the world where we'll be talking about their cultures, their food, their education system, and their way of living. We've been hearing about this place in the news and around the world for a while, but today we get to see a different perspective. Today, I get to introduce you to my friend, Anton O'Malley, who has lived there. He has understand the culture. He loves their food because he happens to be Russian. No further ado, let me introduce you to my friend, Anton.
Hello, everyone. My name is Anton O'Malley. Despite the Irish last name, I did in fact lived in Russia, St. Petersburg, for about 9 to 10 years. And I went to school there. I grew up there. And I was fortunate enough to travel between the United States and Russia, two pretty divided countries. And so I can combine a unique perspective by doing so and seeing the differences in both the countries.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here today. It means a lot. I know you've been traveling. Today, you're luckily we have you here because you live in Boston.
Correct.
And I appreciate you doing this on the last minute. It means a lot. I know even last night we were talking about, being on the podcast, and we were connecting on certain things, especially on education. We were talking about the fact on the, our mathematics stuff. And that's something we'll get more into, but we have connected on, I'm pretty sure, on a lot of other things too, but education was like a big part. And that's how we met. I guess we met through mutual friends in college, Penn State. I know you're repping it. You're a space engineer. Sweatshirt you have on. And, but let's start from the beginning. Give us a little background. How did you, where does the Russian heritage come from? I know you were born in America and then you moved to Russia. So let's get from the beginning. How did that, go about?
My parents met. So my dad is a Irish American, and he was interested in the history of the Soviet Union. And so he decided to take some courses in college on that topic. And he had the opportunity back in, I believe it was like 89, to actually go on a trip there. And so he took that, and that's where he met my mother. And ever since then, they were together. Both didn't speak each other's language, which is the funny part. And then come around the year 2000, I was born on Long Island, New York. And I lived there initially, but, we were kind of going back and forth as I was a kid before school. But second grade, I was fortunate enough to move over there. My parents got a place, both retired. And so that's basically where my real immersion in the culture began, by going to school there. I went there, like I said, second grade, but at that time, I didn't even speak the language. I didn't speak it, I only understood it. And I was just thrown into a regular public school. So I don't really remember too much from there, but I just remember it was being very weird on my first day. The teachers would write something on the board and it's a completely different alphabet, right? Instead of knowing what they were writing, I was just copying what I thought are just symbols.
So how was that? Was it like, for you, I don't want to use the word gibberish, but it's like more so like it was like completely something, I know the Russian alphabet is completely different than any other alphabet in the world.
Correct.
So how was it, like, did you have to take classes there to learn Russian? Like, how did you go about that?
Yeah, so my mom was big into teaching me Russian. That's where I initially grew up to speak it. The alphabet, it all came from her. The alphabet is different. It's Cyrillic. There are some overlapping letters, but it's not like English and French and Spanish where you could kind of read it and still understand. You're not going to understand it, but you could at least read it.
Yeah.
As an English speaker, you can't read Russian. So it is completely different.
So how was it like from, I know you said second grade, and how long you were there for? Like, what was the timeline?
So initially, second through fourth grade, came back to New York, fifth and sixth grade, went back seventh and 10th grade, and then I've basically been back in the States since then.
What are some of the earliest memories you have? What are the good memories you can remember you can share today?
Yeah, regarding the topic of language, I remember like my mom and I were at just a bus stop in Russia, and she's speaking to me in Russian, and I would reply back in English. And, there's not a lot of foreigners in Russia, but there's just one older gentleman, and he like noticed it and said to my mom, like, this is the weirdest thing I've ever seen, but I absolutely love it. And I was probably like 6 years old then. So I guess that is a weird dynamic, but it's the one that I grew up with.
No, that's great. No, I could also connect on that. Like I remember when I first started learning English. My dad spoke English because he lived in America, and then he would come back and forth, and he was trying to speak to us in English, and then that's when I have a hard time. I would respond back in Urdu, and then I get that. I can connect on that part where living in it, especially when I moved to America too, I had to kind of learn the language again. But yeah, no, I understand that that it's quite hard. But how long it took you to learn the whole language, pretty much?
I remember this actually pretty vividly. Started school in September. By October, I was already speaking.
Wow.
Like, pretty fluent. By the end of that year, I was doing good in like Russian language classes.
So let's just say if someone were to learning Russian, I think I mentioned you that I tried to learn Russian at one point. I started listening to songs, Miyagi for example. He's big in Russia. But what are some advices you could give us, like to if you want to learn something?
Same thing with any other language. Start when you're young and immerse yourself in the culture. That's the easiest way.
Well, speaking of cultures, like let's talk about what's the day-to-day life looks like in Russia. I know we have heard a lot of stories from different people, but I know you have lived there, you have experienced it from childhood to you've grown up there. So how is that like? How is like the day-to-day life and your friends and other people around you?
Yeah, I mean, it's really not all that different. It's a Western culture, so what the Western ideals are still there. So I grew up in St. Petersburg. I got to say, the weather there is not the best. So if we're talking culture, I guess it's not really too pertaining to the weather, but at the same time, like winters are kind of brutal, and St. Petersburg can give off that gloomy vibe. Similar to like Amsterdam, you don't really see the sun, but I think that shaped the culture in that city in a sense. Not that it was a brutal city, by no ways is it, but I think just some aspects of it reflect the weather there.
No, yeah, no, the weather. I mean, right now we have that cold winter in America.
Yeah.
No, I get it. But how was like from your schooling perspective, from your friends, like how is that different than like from here? If you were to compare like us from our friend group compared to your friends in Russia, how's that different? What's the difference in that?
It's hard to say, honestly. I guess just speaking a different language to them. But their upbringing is, of course, very different. And so I guess in a sense, I didn't really know this, but I would have to learn to adapt to like the things they did. Like, for an example, in America, NFL is huge. Like everyone talks about that, right? In Russia, something else will be huge. So you just had to get adjusted and start talking about what people wanted to hear in a sense. I was never a fan of the NFL. And so whenever someone starts talking Tom Brady, I'm kind of just lost. I don't know what's going on. And I think that's just the culture thing. Initially, that's how I was in Russia too.
Yeah, no, same thing. Like I'm starting to learn the football culture, just because my friend learned it. But normally we had football, but just we call it soccer. So that we can talk about. And but you mentioned St. Petersburg. Like, give us a little like imagery of what St. Petersburg looked like. Well, I know from the pictures that it's one of the beautiful cities in Russia. But give us a little bit of imagery. Like, what's the spots that you went to and you could you remember to now?
Absolutely beautiful city situated on a river. Architecture wise, very diverse. We in school we took classes on architecture in St. Petersburg, and you learn about all the different styles, and you learn about all the different architects that traveled all throughout Europe to come to St. Petersburg and design whatever they're doing. And so whether we're talking about cathedrals, museums, palaces, it's very, 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 very rich. Even apartment buildings, there's always some design to them. There's always some aspect of culture on them. And, World War II had some devastating effects on the city. But to the current day, you kind of see those effects, but it's part of what makes the city the city.
That's a great response. And I think, every city has its unique culture. I feel like it, especially in a country like Russia, it's so big. I guess the geographically, where it's placed in the map. It's a different culture in different cities. On your travels, I mean, is there any other places you have traveled to within Russia that you have experienced different cultures, or maybe even a different environment?
Yeah, so I've gone up north a little bit, about 4 or 5 hours north of St. Petersburg, to this area called Karelia, which is, if I'm correct, it used to be like a Finnish territory. But the difference really is that it's more rural. And so I saw that aspect of Russia, which before I ever left St. Petersburg, I never even thought that existed. But it's a beautiful area. The other area that just actually 2 years ago I went to was Moscow. Oh man, that city's something. It's
give us a little more, because I know we've been hearing about Moscow so much. Give us the rundown of what it looks like.
Progressive, modern, fast paced. Reminds me a little bit of New York City. There's a new area there called Moscow City, and that's where they're building all the skyscrapers. If you're walking in that area, you're gonna think you're in New York. But yeah, it's modern. It's really modern. They have stuff that America doesn't. For one example, the ferries that run through the city, they're electric.
Oh wow,
beautiful electric ferries. I mean, we don't have electric ferries that I know of in the United States.
Yeah, I don't recall any.
Even just little things like, timetables at every bus station or bus stop. I don't remember that being in New York. Sure, it's not everywhere, but it was there. And one example, I guess, of the progressive aspect of that, when Apple Pay came out, it didn't really go far in the US. It was very slow to develop. And, even the biggest retailer, Walmart, they don't even have Apple Pay at this point.
Yeah.
About a year after Apple Pay came out, even grandmas in Russia were accepting it, selling like cucumbers on the street.
Yeah, no, see, those are the things we don't see normally. We have this stereotypical thing where, like, it's like even the technology, so to speak, we're quite ahead of time in America. That's what they project as. Right. But there are so many other places that are like even way ahead of time. Like you mentioned, even grandmas. Like I know, like even back home in Pakistan, I went recently, and then everywhere I went, I normally, it's considered to be a third world country, but this time I went and I didn't realize I felt like I was walking in Europe. Because everyone is so ahead of time. I felt like in certain places, even the tap, like everyone was like accepting Apple Pay, and it was such a crazy thing to experience, because you normally, like, you living in America, you're like, okay, this is only happening in America, no one else does this. So no, that's awesome. Growing up, I mean, I'm a foodie. I love food. So growing up, like, let's talk about some food. Food plays a big aspect, I guess, in the culture aspect of it, or in the region aspect of it. So how was the food like? I mean, compared to America, and compared to, have you found any Russian restaurants or dishes here that you're like, oh, this is not the similar thing, but it's okay, it works out. And then you go back home, it's like, oh my God, it's such a different thing. What's the food situation looks like?
It's weird. I'm not huge into Russian food. I'm more into like Southern Russian food. So
what's the difference?
That's a good question. I would say it's more like heavier. For example, well, when I say Southern Russian, I mean kind of the Caucasus region. So like Georgian food, Azeri food, that made its way up north to St. Petersburg. And I think in a sense it shaped even what Russian food is today. But, all right, let's go back to Russian food. Bliny. I guess the equivalent of crepes. Delicious. You could do them with honey. You could do them with salmon. You could do them with a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah.
Beef stroganoff, pretty Russian. Just beef and mashed potatoes and mushrooms, stuff like that. But when you invited me onto the podcast, you mentioned we were going to talk about food. One of the biggest difference I've noticed last time I was there is how much less beef they eat. Beef is a very American thing. It's not like I just mentioned beef stroganoff. That's kind of a 1% type of deal. A lot of chicken, a lot of seafood. Potatoes are huge.
That's the same aspect. Even back home when I traveled, beef is not something big. I think it is an American thing mostly. But we eat chicken. Potatoes, I don't know why, but potatoes are always big in every country. Like I've got always even in Pakistani dishes, everything has something to do with potatoes or chicken. But we have other vegetable dishes too. But like potatoes do play a really big factor in our culture too. I don't know why when it comes to food, it's such a weird thing. It must be, like I said, it must be the region thing. That's but no, that's great. I mean, when you moved here to America, like is there some, what were the culture differences you had to, I guess learn? Like, what was the difficulties you had to go through? Like, you already spoke English, but when you moved here, was it weird to be here, or like starting everything all over again, like you did in Russia? You kind of learned everything. Was it the same thing here?
Yeah. So, like I mentioned, I kind of went back and forth between school. When you're a kid, a teenager, making that switch is difficult. And so that definitely played a role in how I kind of interacted with the kids in either respective country. There was definitely things I had to learn, like the football thing. That was honestly a huge thing. All middle schoolers in America talk about football, all that type of stuff. And I was always kind of on the sidelines being like, I don't really know much about this. But going to Russia was the same way. Granted, I have to say, being like an American in Russia, people, at least back then, would almost look up to you because it's such a, I don't want to say weird, but I'm going to say weird thing, fresh into experience. There are not many migrants that go there, mostly immigrants. And so people would a little bit kind of be fascinated. They're like, oh, this American kid, this type of stuff. So I kind of had, I don't say the privilege, but people noticed me, I would say.
Is it because you just stood out from your looks, your language, and everything else wise, or was it something else?
I would say language. Even though I spoke it, I had an accent. And, like I said, you won't find many people in Russia speaking Russian with an accent. That's not really a thing. And so I think that's what kind of, I don't want to say help stood me out, but
that played up.
Yeah.
I mean, I can talk about it. I mean, I know I have an accent. When I moved here, when I started speaking English, everyone realized that I was, not from America just as soon as I start speaking. So I do understand that, and that's play a big factor when when you're from outside, or they call you, it's the whole different aspect. So going back to school in Russia. Like, how's the education system like? What is it? Is it easier or harder compared to here?
It's really good.
It's really good.
It's really good.
Like, I know we were talking about it last night, that we were talking about our maths. I know our mathematics is quite high. Like, compared to here, it's quite advanced in some of the regions.
Math is advanced. Literature.
Yeah. Well, so if like when you, so let's go back to when you moved here. You went to state college. When after like moving here, then you went to college here. I guess compared to a little bit of education from college perspective, and your friends back home, some of them, or if you go, they're in colleges, or their stories, when they tell you their stories and you tell them their stories, how's that different?
It's a good question. I mean, college life in America is so different than anywhere else, I think, in the world. For them, going to college is, you don't go to a campus, you don't dorm, nothing really like that. So for them, it was a little bit more of a commuter situation. While for me, like, I went to state college and stayed there. University-wise, Russia, I don't think stands out on the global stage. Whether that's intentional or not, I don't know. But, primary education, I think was really good there. And I think that's why my parents brought me there. For example, I'd have classes, like I've mentioned, in architecture. I'd have world art classes, field trips were like to the Winter Palace, to different palaces around St. Petersburg, to museums, all that type of stuff. And I remember, I came back to the US, like 5th, 6th grade, we'd go like on a field trip to the pumpkin patch. So
yeah, no, that's a big difference that I also have experienced too. But I guess that's how the education system is, I guess, here. That's like a big difference, rather than we tend to go like in back home, like we took field trips to places where things were happening, like historical places a lot, to and then how our decisions or things that impacted the rest of the world and stuff like that. That was like something that I was taught from quite a young age, and what we play a role in the world review to also like just the cultural review of things that are around here. But I know we also learned about Russia. The one thing we learned is like where languages are different, but there are certain aspects of a language that are quite similar. Like when it comes to fruits, the fruits that you guys say, it's the same thing in Urdu and in Russian. So and then also as in Russia happened to be a lot of Muslim community lives in Russia, so that's another way that we learned about that. Because growing up, it's like, oh, you live in a Muslim country, there's a certain aspect you're bound to follow and do, and I always thought it was just, oh, it only happens in Pakistan. Then I slowly started to meet more friends, learned that there's, oh my God, there's like, there are countries that are not mostly predominantly Muslim, but they still have somewhat of an aspect on that and effect on that. So no, that's awesome. How did you? I know there's something really interesting about you. You're a pilot.
Correct.
You are. How did that go about? Let's just talk about that for a second. I know it's off topic, but I want to talk about your pilot license, because I think that's the most interesting thing I come across.
Thank you.
So talk about a bit about your pilot becoming a pilot. How was that like?
So I think my love for aviation just came from the fact I had to travel all the time and go internationally. But I remember even as like an 8-year-old, I'd play around with Legos and I'd like make little airports on the floor. And I think for my 9th birthday, my mom got me a flight simulator. Ever since then, it just took off. No pun intended. And when I was around 13, I was driving with my dad near the airport, and he was randomly like, why don't we just go talk to the flight school? And so we did. And I started training when I was 13, did my solo when I was 16, got my license at 17.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Have you been flying since then? Like, do you try to fly as much as possible?
I haven't, and I regret it. I think life just got in the way, especially with school. It's definitely something I'm going to get back into, and I know I will. Luckily, the license never expires.
That's awesome. You said, your traveling helped you kind of motivate to get your license or become a pilot. Mm-hmm. When you were traveling, did you kind of like take the culture stayed with you, the Russian culture stayed with you in some aspect? And how were, you were to wherever you traveled to, and how was that compared to back home? Like, did you see everything, something new you had to learn, or there were some similarities in different cultures you came across?
I'm sure I took the culture with me. I wouldn't know, and I wouldn't have any examples of what that could have been. Maybe that Russia's a pretty superstitious country. I don't want to say that, but like there are a lot of superstitions, and there are some that I still follow. For example, you don't greet or say bye to anyone over a doorstep, or just a bunch of like little things like that I'll still follow. Very well off that none of my friends even know I do that, but it's just something that I keep in my head. And if they're trying to say bye to me over the doorstep, I put one foot in the door.
Yeah. So do you still do that to your American friends to this day? And they're like, what are you doing?
Yeah, but I don't even think they know I'm doing it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's almost just for me, basically.
Yeah, I see. No, I think that's because I have mentioned this before, where like when I moved here, there's certain things I did just because we had, in our culture, we're supposed to greet in a certain way and all that stuff. And when my friends would come over my house and I would certain these things, they'd be like, dude, what are you doing? Why are you so moving around? Just relax, have a sit down or all that. But yeah, I can relate to that. That's a big aspect when it comes to culture. There's greetings and certain things you're supposed to do and not do with certain people. But no, that's awesome. And so is that why? I mean, I know we met at Penn State. You were into aerospace. So is that how your love of traveling and your love of flying got into airspace?
That's why I picked the major. I like math. I was one of those weird kids, and I have a creative side to me. So I thought that combining that with math, with my love for aviation, that's the major I wanted to pursue. So yeah.
So how is it, if you could give a little bit of a rundown, how is aerospace compared to everything else? I mean, I know it's one of the hardest program at Penn State, especially. Mm-hmm. How is that? Like, give us a little bit of rundown of what that 4-year looks like.
First 2 years, relatively on the easier side. You're doing your general engineering classes, math classes, calculus, that type of stuff. Junior year, very difficult. That's when, head in the books all the time. And then my 4th year, I'd say is the most fun year because you get to do your capstone. You work on an actual project. And so I was in a team of 7 people, and we worked on a lunar surface transporter vehicle, basically a truck for the moon. That's the simplest terms.
That's awesome. And now for example, like what if you were to be in Russia and doing all this? How would that be? Do you think would be more easier, difficult, more fun, or like, it would be challenging? How would that look like for you if you were in Russia?
I think it could have been, well, if I stayed there and finished school there, I think it would have felt the exact same way as if, going to Penn State. But let's say I came back for high school here in the US and then I went back, I think the challenge would be the technical language. It's difficult. I remember when I came back to the US, I initially wanted to take my SATs in Russian just because of math and how they're, little differences. For example, like sine, cosine.
Yeah.
You write it the same way in Russian, but tangent, right? Tan.
Yeah.
In America, it's tan. In Russia, it's TG.
TG.
So initially, I didn't know what tan was. And then I was like, oh, that's what that is. So just little differences like that. I think that would have played a big role. Like I remember during my undergrad at Penn State, I actually cited some Russian papers and from aerospace schools there. And I was reading through them in Russian, of course, and I didn't understand half of what was written. As soon as I throw it into like Google Translate, I'm like, oh, that's what they mean.
So even so when do you, like I sometimes think, like you said, translating it changes some stuff. So sometime when I am thinking, I think in Urdu and say in English. Do you do that sometimes, or do you think in a different language and speak in a different language sometimes, or no?
Now I mostly think in English, but I remember back then it would depend what I'm thinking about.
I see.
Yeah, so it's like half and half almost.
Yeah, no. Normally, some days when I'm doing something, I'll think in Urdu because it's just faster and easier to think because it's my first language. Or even and then I speak in English. And there's been times where like I'm speaking in English, all of a sudden Urdu starts to kick in. Does that happen to you, where like you get angry or excited, or all of a sudden Russian starts to flow?
Yeah, I would say so. Probably when I'm angry.
Yeah.
Probably when I'm angry. Yeah.
I know it's I feel like when it comes to curse words, would you say you use English curse words or Russian curse words a lot? I know amongst friends, I know what kind of words you use in what language, so that's why I'm asking. What do you prefer when it comes to? Because I feel like that's when one truly gets angry, and just it's something about just cursing in your first language or even a different language. It's just different.
I'll say the answer to that will be how descriptive I want to be.
I see.
Russian is much more descriptive. You can turn your words into exactly what you want them to be. Honestly, I think it's half and half. Like, if someone just accidentally like hits me with the door, I might just shout out something in Russian. It just depends on the moment.
No, these days, like, even last night too, when we were at the dinner, we were start talking in Hindi, me and Shub, and then you start saying something in Russian, and then we had our other friend Ashad, he starts saying it in something in his language, and it was just like back and forth with like everyone speaking a different language. But the funny thing was like we all understood each other regarding what we were saying,
right? Because
we were just saying something that doesn't need to be translated; it just needs to be like heard.
It's the emotions and the expression.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's all it's about, like just understanding each other, and then just seeing different perspective and getting ideas from different people. And I think in our group we have quite a diverse group, and that's how we get to understand different languages, different cultures, and that's what I wanted to share with everyone today. Pretty much, we have so many different friend groups and so many different backgrounds that we are willing to just sit down and have fun, laugh, regardless of where we're from. We go through the same kind of issues and problems. We can connect on it, especially when you're from other side of the world. We always have something that we can connect on. So I just want to say thank you for sharing your story and how everything was. Is there anything that you want to talk or you want to let the viewers know, or the listeners, that something about Russia that people have a misconception about that you think it's not true? So it's all yours. Your floor is yours. Yeah,
I mean, in lieu of current events, I'll say this for any country. Don't always listen to the stereotypes. I think this podcast is great because you actually get to bring someone on that lived that experience, and I think that people should be less judgmental and should be open-minded. What you just talked about, I think that comes to open-mindedness, and I think that people have to realize, we're all humans, and we all just want to be happy, and that's the image that Russians are all these like mean people and whatnot. We might come across that, but we're teddy bears, and I think that if you learn any culture and really what it's about, you're going to be happy, they're going to be happy.
Yeah, no, I can speak for that. It's teddy bear, because I do have other friends that are from Russian descent, and just sitting with them, it's such a great time. We get to connect on a bunch of things. We get to laugh, and some of the things are stereotypical things that we get to laugh at because we all have some sort of stereotypical things behind us. So, but no, that's a great way to put it. And I just want to say thank you again for, being here and sharing that part of your life and part of that story. I hope you get into this year. I'm really pushing you to travel more, especially on your plane. We're trying to get you a plane, get that plane ready, get the license ready.
Let's go.
And get the whole gang on it, and we can travel the world and get to learn more about the world around us. So on that note, I just want to say thank you to everyone who's listening. Thank you to Anton for being here today, and see you all next time.
Thank you for having me.